Dorothea Puente. She looked like someone's grandmother. Silver curls, thick glasses, a polite voice. She volunteered at charities, baked cookies, and dressed in floral skirts. But behind the lace curtains of her Sacramento boarding house, Dorothea Puente was hiding a secret darker than anyone imagined. The bodies of her tenants, buried in her backyard. In the 1980s, Dorothea ran a boarding home for the elderly, disabled, and vulnerable. The kind of people society forgets. She was known for being strict, but kind. Tenants called her Mom. Social workers trusted her. And every month government checks arrived at her doorstep and were quietly signed over. But something wasn't right. Residents kept disappearing. Dorothea always had excuses. They'd gone to live with relatives, checked into hospitals, left without warning. No one questioned her too much. After all, she was just an old woman doing a good deed. But in 1988, it all unraveled. When a mentally disabled tenant named Alberto Montoya vanished, his social worker demanded answers. Dorothea gave her the usual story. He'd gone to visit family, but investigators were sent to the house anyway, and in the backyard, beneath a thin layer of soil and some fresh concrete, they made a horrifying discovery. A human leg bone, then more bones, then full bodies. 7 in total. The smell had been there for years. Neighbors assumed it was just garbage or cats, but the truth was rotting beneath their feet. Dorothea didn't wait around to answer questions. She vanished, fled to Los Angeles, checked into a motel under a fake name, but it didn't take long. A man recognized her from a news broadcast and tipped off police. She was arrested a few days later, calm, composed, and still dressed like someone's sweet grandmother. At trial, she claimed the tenants had died of natural causes, that she buried them out of panic, that she was just trying to help. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic reports showed drugs in the victims' systems, overdoses of sleeping pills and sedatives. The bodies had been wrapped in sheets and duct tape. Their government checks were still being cashed by Dorothea. Prosecutors argued that she targeted the weak on purpose. People who couldn't fight back, who had no family, who wouldn't be missed. And all for one reason: money. Thousands of dollars over several years. A quiet fortune built on silent deaths. In 1993, she was convicted of 3 murders, though authorities believe she killed at least 9. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole and died behind bars in 2011 at the age of 82. What makes her story so disturbing isn't just the number of victims, it's how invisible the violence was. No gunshots, no screams, it's just a teacup, a pill, and a promise of safety, followed by a shallow grave. Dorothea Puente didn't chase her victims, she welcomed them, and while the world saw an old woman with a kind face, her backyard told the truth. 3. Aileen Wuornos. She was America's first female, but she didn't hide in the shadows. Aileen Wuornos walked the highways of Florida, hitchhiking, drifting from motel to motel, surviving by sex work and instinct. She claimed she killed in self-defense. But the bodies told another story, and so did the gun she carried. Born in Michigan in 1956, Aileen's life was broken before it began. Her father was a convicted child molester who died by suicide in prison. Her mother abandoned her. By 11, she was pregnant after being raped by a family friend. By 15, she was living in the woods. Survival wasn't a choice, it was all she knew. By the late 1980s, Aileen had made her way to Florida, surviving through prostitution, theft, and occasional arrests. But what happened between December 1989 and November 1990 would make her infamous. Over that year, 7 men were found dead along remote highways, all shot multiple times with the same weapon, a .22 caliber pistol. All had picked up a woman on the road, and all had one thing in common: they never made it home. Police recovered a fingerprint from a stolen car belonging to one of the victims. It led to Wuornos and to her lover, Thier. When authorities arrested Aileen at a biker bar in Daytona Beach in January 1991, she went quietly, but she didn't stay quiet for long. In a recorded confession, she admitted to the killings. She claimed the first man had raped her. That after that, she killed to protect herself. But the evidence was murky. Some victims were shot multiple times in the back. One was found with his pockets turned out. Robbery seemed just as likely as rage. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory, a convicted sex offender, was televised. The media painted her as a monster. a woman who hated men, a vigilante turned predator. Her eyes, her anger, her profanity-filled outbursts, all of it became spectacle. But behind the headlines was a woman who had never known love, safety, or peace. In 1992, she was convicted and sentenced to death. Over the next decade, she would cycle through appeals, psychiatric evaluations, and media interviews. Some called her evil. Others called her broken. In her final years, she dismissed her defense, refused further appeals, and asked to be executed. She said she was tired. She said she was ready. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her final words were chilling, cryptic, and unrepentant. "I'll be back. Like Independence Day with Jesus." She left behind 7 dead men, a nation gripped by her story, and a legacy that blurred the line between victim and villain. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or the product of a world that never gave her a chance? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Aileen Wuornos changed how America sees female murderers, forever. 3. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy Williams wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the dark. She was a mother, a daughter, a woman who once had a future. But what unfolded on the south side of Chicago in the late 1980s was a slow, devastating descent from ordinary life into violent crime, all driven by a hunger more powerful than reason: addiction. Born in 1953, Dorothy's early life wasn't marked by violence, but by adulthood. She was living in the grip of heroin, and the streets became her home. She had a pattern. She'd befriend elderly victims, gain their trust, then rob them. But sometimes, robbery turned into murder. Her first known victim was a 97-year-old woman named Mary Harris. Dorothy had visited her apartment under the pretense of needing help. Instead, she brutally beat and strangled her. For what? A few dollars and a purse. It didn't stop there. Her next victim, 79-year-old Lillian Williams, no relation, was attacked just weeks later. Strangled with such force, investigators found the imprint of Dorothy's fingers around her neck. Again, the motive was robbery. But the method? Cold, deliberate, and personal. And then came 88-year-old Albert Pearl, a man who had once shown her kindness. She repaid him by murdering him in his own home, just to steal his belongings and sell them for drug money. In each case, Dorothy's strategy was the same: pick an elderly target, exploit their vulnerability, and strike with speed and brutality. But the final murder left behind too many clues. Witnesses, fingerprints, and physical evidence tied her to the scene. When arrested, Dorothy didn't offer excuses, but she didn't show remorse either. Her addiction had become a monster that devoured everything: her morality, her conscience, and ultimately, her freedom. She was charged with multiple counts of murder. During her trial, prosecutors called her crimes cruel, calculated, and heartless. The jury agreed. Dorothy Williams was sentenced to death in Illinois in 1991, one of the rare women on death row in the state at the time. But in 2003, Illinois commuted all death sentences to life without parole, sparing her from execution. Today, she remains behind bars, serving out the rest of her days in prison. She wasn't the image of a serial killer. She was a mother with track marks, a woman who let heroin control her every move, and in the process, she left a trail of innocent lives destroyed. Not just her victims, but their families and her own. Addiction may have started her downfall, but what she chose to do for her next fix is what made her unforgettable. 4. Jane Toppan. She had one of the most trusted jobs in society. A nurse, a woman meant to heal, meant to comfort. But Jane Toppan didn't walk into hospitals with a stethoscope and compassion in her heart. She walked in with a syringe and a desire to play God. Born Honora Kelly in 1854, Jane was abandoned by her alcoholic father and raised in a Boston orphanage. By the time she adopted the name Toppan and began her nursing career, she had already learned how to wear a mask. One that smiled, one that soothed, one that disarmed. But underneath that mask was something deeply disturbed. Jane didn't just kill her patients, she enjoyed it. She confessed to experimenting on them with morphine and atropine, alternating doses to see how close she could bring them to death, before pulling them back. Sometimes, she would climb into bed beside them as they slipped away, watching the light leave their eyes like a scientist studying a reaction. Her victims weren't strangers. They were elderly women, patients she was assigned to care for. They were friends, housekeepers, even members of the family she lived with. And she didn't stop there. She murdered her foster sister, her landlord, and others who simply got in her way. By the time Jane was arrested in 1901, suspicion had grown around the unnatural number of deaths surrounding her. It wasn't long before she confessed, and what she said shocked even the most seasoned detectives. She claimed to have murdered at least 31 people, but some experts believe the true number was over 100. When asked why, her answer was chillingly simple: "I was born with the desire to kill." Jane Toppan wasn't sent to prison. She was declared criminally insane and spent the rest of her life in the Taunton Insane Hospital. But even there, she terrified the staff. Nurses reported that she would smile at them from the shadows, whisper at night, and say things like, "Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out into the ward. You and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die." She died in 1938, after nearly 40 years in confinement. But the legacy she left behind is one of pure psychological horror. Jane Toppan turned the most nurturing profession into a hunting ground. She wore kindness like a costume and used it to destroy. She didn't just kill, she made death a game. And the scariest part? No one saw it coming, because everyone trusted her. The 5 Amelia Dyer. She claimed she was offering help, a safe place for unwanted children, a solution for desperate mothers. But behind closed doors, Amelia Dyer turned that promise of safety into a death sentence. And for decades, no one noticed. No one stopped her, until it was far too late. Born in 1837 in Bristol, England, Amelia Dyer trained as a nurse and midwife. But when poverty and opportunity collided, she found a new calling: baby farming. At the time, single mothers were often shunned and unable to care for their children. Dyer offered to adopt these babies for a fee, promising to raise them in a loving home. It was a lie. Once the money changed hands, the infants were no longer seen as lives, just burdens. Amelia would suffocate them, often within days of receiving them. Some were drugged with opiates, others were simply starved. She wrapped their tiny bodies in carpet, tucked them into boxes or bags, and tossed them into rivers or left them to rot. Over the years, she moved frequently to avoid suspicion. She changed names, used aliases, and even faked illnesses to throw off authorities. But the death toll kept growing, child after child, disappearing into silence. It's estimated that she murdered over 400 infants, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. In 1896, her crimes finally caught up to her when the body of a baby girl was discovered floating in the River Thames. Inside the parcel, police found a clue: a piece of paper with Dyer's address. What followed was a nationwide investigation, uncovering dozens of bodies and years of deception. During her trial, Dyer showed little emotion. When asked about her actions, she chillingly remarked, "I used to like to watch them die." The court found her guilty of one murder, just one, but it was enough. Amelia Dyer was sentenced to death and hanged at Newgate Prison on June 10, 1896. She was 58 years old. Her case shocked Victorian England, sparking major reforms in child protection and adoption laws. But it also raised deeper, darker questions. How could a woman, a mother, a midwife, someone entrusted with the care of life, commit such unfathomable cruelty? Amelia Dyer didn't kill for passion. She didn't kill in self-defense. She killed for profit, over and over again, and smiled while doing it. She turned motherhood into a market, and trust into a trap. For hundreds of innocent babies, she was the last face they ever saw. 6. Tillie Klimek. She told friends she had the gift of foresight, that she could predict exactly when people around her would die. But Tillie Klimek's chilling predictions weren't visions, they were blueprints. Because the deaths she foresaw only happened after she cooked dinner. Born Ottilie Gieburek in Poland and raised in Chicago's Little Poland neighborhood, Tillie was seen by many as a quiet housewife with a strange sense of humor. When her first husband died suddenly in 1914, people mourned, but Tillie remained composed. She claimed she dreamed of his death the night before. No one suspected anything. But when her second husband also died, and then her third, and then her fourth, the neighborhood started whispering. Each man had fallen ill in a matter of days, and each time, Tillie had calmly told people he wouldn't survive. The truth emerged only when her fifth husband, Joseph Klimek, suddenly collapsed after eating her stew. But this time, he survived. Doctors found high traces of arsenic in his system. Investigators soon discovered a pattern. Tillie had been poisoning her husbands, and in some cases her relatives, neighbors, even a dog, with arsenic-laced food. They exhumed the bodies of several of her late husbands. Autopsies confirmed what many now feared: death by poison. It wasn't just Joseph who'd been lucky. Others had perished slowly, painfully, as she calmly cared for them beside their sickbeds. The image of a grieving wife, concealing the fact that she was the killer. What was her motive? Some pointed to money, life insurance policies, and small inheritances. Others believed it was power. Tillie took pleasure in control. She'd brag about her predictions, tell her neighbors to watch, and then wait for death to prove her right. Her trial in 1923 was one of Chicago's most sensational. The media dubbed her the Merry Widow because of her cold, smirking demeanor in court. Witnesses testified about her boasting, her cooking, and the strange coincidences that followed her meals. She showed no remorse. And when the guilty verdict was read, she didn't cry. She laughed. Tillie Klimek was sentenced to life in prison, one of the first women in Illinois to receive such a punishment. She died behind bars in 1936, having outlived all the husbands she killed. She didn't use a gun. She didn't need a knife. All it took was trust, a warm bowl of stew, and a few grains of arsenic. Behind her apron and apron strings was a serial killer hiding in plain sight. Her victims thought they were being loved, but in Tillie's kitchen, they were being slowly erased. 7. Lavinia Fisher. She wore a smile that welcomed travelers and a dress that charmed strangers. To passers-by in early 1800s Charleston, Lavinia Fisher seemed like the perfect hostess, polite, graceful, and always ready with a warm cup of tea. But behind the walls of the 6-mile Wayfarer house, her true nature was something else entirely. Something darker. Something deadly. Lavinia and her husband, John Fisher, operated their inn just outside Charleston, South Carolina. Far enough from town to avoid regular scrutiny, but close enough to attract visitors. The inn welcomed travelers with open arms, and then quietly made them vanish. Over time, rumors began to circulate. Guests would check in, but never check out. Horses were found abandoned nearby. Belongings were missing, but there was no proof. Not yet. According to legend, Lavinia would serve her male guests a cup of tea laced with a mysterious substance, possibly laudanum or poison. Once the victim passed out, John Fisher would enter the room. In some versions, the bed itself would collapse, dropping the body into a pit below. In others, the guests were simply robbed and killed. The bodies? Buried, burned, disposed of, never to be seen again. The couple's crimes remained hidden until 1819, when a man named John Peoples refused Lavinia's tea and grew suspicious. He left the inn in the middle of the night and alerted authorities. A raid followed, and what they found shocked even hardened investigators. The grounds were littered with stolen belongings, evidence of violence, and shallow graves. The 6-mile house was no longer an inn, it was a graveyard. Lavinia and John were arrested, tried, and convicted. Though the precise number of their victims remains unknown, some believe it could have been in the dozens. During the trial, Lavinia denied everything, claiming she was just a woman following her husband's orders. But witnesses described her as the one who seduced, distracted, and drugged the victims. On the day of her execution in 1820, Lavinia Fisher wore a white wedding dress and stood before the crowd at the gallows. Her final words were chilling. "If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly." Then she stepped off the platform herself. Lavinia Fisher is often called America's first female serial killer. Whether that's folklore or fact remains debated. But her story endures because it shattered the illusion of feminine innocence in a time when women were seen as passive, gentle, and harmless. Behind her elegant smile was a predator. Behind her teacup was a trap. She didn't just kill. She turned hospitality into horror. And every guest who walked through her door never imagined they'd stepped into a death sentence. 8. Lucy Letby. She was supposed to be a guardian of life, a neonatal nurse trusted with the most fragile patients in the hospital, premature babies clinging to survival. With her soft features, gentle voice, and bright scrubs, Lucy Letby looked like the embodiment of care. But behind that appearance was a darkness no one wanted to believe. a darkness that crept through the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital, leaving grief in its wake. Between 2015 and 2016, a disturbing pattern emerged. Newborns who had been stable suddenly collapsed. Their oxygen levels dropped without explanation. Some bled internally, some suffered air embolisms. Many died. The hospital launched an internal investigation, and what they found was horrifying. All the incidents occurred during Letby's shifts. Letby had left no outward signs of guilt. She consoled grieving parents. She wrote sympathy cards. She even attended the funerals. But as investigators dug deeper, the evidence became undeniable. Medical records were altered. Vials were tampered with. Her search history revealed chilling queries, like looking up the parents of deceased babies, long after their deaths. In 2023, after years of investigation and a lengthy trial, Lucy Letby was convicted of murdering 7 newborns and attempting to murder 6 more. The methods were methodical and deliberate. Injecting air into veins and stomachs, overfeeding milk, tampering with breathing tubes, all of it done to babies who couldn't cry for help, who could barely even breathe on their own. The courtroom gasped as the evidence mounted. Parents described the horror of watching their infants deteriorate without reason. Experts testified that the deaths were not natural, they were engineered. And at the center of it all was Letby, sitting quietly in the defendant's chair, showing little emotion. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a rare whole life order, meaning she will never be released. In Britain, it's one of the harshest penalties possible, and in this case, few believed it was harsh enough. Letby's case sent shockwaves through the UK and the world. A nurse, a protector, had become the predator. She weaponized trust. She used the hospital, the monitors, the feeding tubes as tools of death, and she masked it all beneath the guise of care. The question that still haunts everyone is, why? Letby offered no explanation. Psychologists speculated about control, attention-seeking, or deep-rooted pathology. But the truth may never be fully known. What is known is this: 7 babies were killed, 6 more narrowly escaped, and the woman charged with saving them chose instead to silence them forever. 9. Elfriede Blauensteiner. She wore designer clothes, styled her hair immaculately, and was often seen walking her beloved poodle through the quiet streets of Vienna. To neighbors, Elfriede Blauensteiner seemed like an elegant, lonely widow, someone who had simply known too much heartache. But behind that refined exterior was one of Austria's most manipulative serial killers. A woman who didn't just bury her lovers, she profited from them. Elfriede's crimes began in the 1980s and stretched into the 1990s, targeting lonely elderly men with money. She would seduce them, move into their lives, and eventually convince them, or forge documents, to make herself the sole heir to their estates. And then they would fall mysteriously ill. Her weapon of choice was poison, often a carefully measured cocktail of sedatives and insulin. Her victims would grow weak, confused, and disoriented. By the time doctors were alerted, it was often too late. Elfriede would mourn publicly, attend the funerals, and walk away richer. But it wasn't just 1 or 2 deaths. Authorities believe Elfriede may have killed up to 10 people, including a close friend and even her own husband. Her pattern was disturbingly consistent: manipulate, isolate, poison, and inherit. And she left little room for suspicion, until she made a fatal mistake. In 1997, her final victim, Alois Pickler, a 77-year-old man she had recently befriended, began showing signs of drug poisoning. This time, investigators were watching. Traces of drugs were found in his system. Suspicion turned into evidence, and when authorities searched her home, they uncovered forgeries, prescription abuse, and financial records linking her to several suspicious deaths. Elfriede was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted of murdering Pickler. Though she was only formally convicted of 1 murder, prosecutors argued that she had orchestrated a killing spree spanning over a decade. In court, she remained cold and unapologetic. Her only concern seemed to be the well-being of her poodle, who was eventually placed in the care of a friend. In 2001, she was sentenced to life in prison. But true to form, Elfriede tried to manipulate the narrative one last time, granting interviews, denying guilt, and casting herself as misunderstood. She died in prison in 2003, taking with her the full extent of her crimes. Elfriede Blauensteiner became known as the Black Widow of Vienna, not just because she killed men she was involved with, but because she embodied the seductive danger hidden behind civility. She weaponized loneliness, she turned affection into a trap, and she proved that sometimes the most dangerous killer doesn't carry a knife, she carries a smile and a pen. 10. Katarzyna Onyszkiewiczowa. In 19th century Poland, she was known as a gifted seamstress, quiet, hardworking, and always ready with a smile. Katarzyna Onyszkiewiczowa blended into her community like any other modest woman of her time. She mended clothes, attended mass, and offered polite conversation. But behind the lace and thread was a woman hiding a far more sinister craft. One not of fabric, but of death. Between 1869 and 1870, Katarzyna developed a method of murder that was as profitable as it was gruesome. Her targets were wealthy landlords and traveling merchants. With charm and calculation, she gained their trust, often disguising herself in elegant clothing to appear higher in social status. Once inside their good graces, she served them tea, laced with arsenic. Her motive was simple: money. Once the victims were dead, she would rob them and disappear, leaving behind little evidence. In an era with minimal forensic science and patchy law enforcement, Katarzyna exploited every blind spot. But her downfall came not from a mistaken poison or a missed detail, it came from her pattern. The deaths followed a traceable trail. Investigators in several towns began noticing a disturbing pattern. Healthy men, often well off, dying after visiting or encountering a mysterious woman matching Katarzyna's description. Eventually, a sting operation was set up, and Katarzyna was caught red-handed, with poison in her belongings and stolen goods in her possession. During her trial, witnesses described her as cold and remorseless. She admitted to several of the murders without emotion. The courtroom and the country were stunned. A seemingly harmless woman, a seamstress no less, had managed to outwit and outkill some of the region's most powerful men. She was convicted and sentenced to death, and in 1870, Katarzyna Onyszkiewiczowa was publicly executed. Her case left behind a chilling legacy, a reminder that killers don't always come with a scowl or a weapon in hand. Sometimes they come with a tray of tea and the patience to wait. What made Katarzyna truly terrifying was how ordinary she appeared. She didn't scream, she didn't stab, she didn't chase. She simply watched, smiled, and waited for the poison to take hold. Her victims never saw it coming, not until it was far too late. To this day, Katarzyna remains one of Eastern Europe's most infamous female serial killers, and her story lingers as a ghost of caution. Beware the one who blends in too well. Because sometimes the deadliest threat is the one dressed like your neighbor and offering you a drink. 11. Charlotte and Linda Mulhall. In the heart of Dublin, Ireland, in the summer of 2005, two sisters committed a crime so gruesome it shocked the entire nation, and earned them a nickname that still sends chills down spines: the Scissor Sisters. Charlotte and Linda Mulhall didn't just kill a man, they dismembered him in their mother's bathroom. The victim was Farah Swala Noor, a Kenyan immigrant and boyfriend to their mother, Kathleen Mulhall. According to court records, Farah had a violent history, and tensions in the home were running high. On that fateful night, a heated argument escalated. Witnesses would later describe how the sisters, fueled by alcohol and rage, snapped. In a moment of explosive violence, Linda reportedly struck Farah with a hammer, and Charlotte stabbed him more than 20 times with a kitchen knife. But it didn't end there. What followed was a chilling effort to erase the evidence. The sisters dismembered his body in the bathroom, using knives and scissors. They placed his limbs and torso into sports bags and plastic bags, and then scattered them across the Grand Canal. The only part of his body ever recovered was the headless torso. His head, never found. The forensic cleanup was amateur at best, and DNA evidence quickly led investigators back to the Mulhall home. The sisters were arrested, and during their trial, the country was gripped by the horror of the details. Not just the murder, but the brutality, the method, the lack of remorse. The Irish media dubbed them the Scissor Sisters, not as a joke, but as a way to express the sheer horror of two siblings working together to destroy a body. In court, neither sister denied their role. Linda was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years. Charlotte, who inflicted most of the stab wounds, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. The case forced Ireland to confront something uncomfortable, that even in quiet households, under the weight of poverty, substance abuse, and domestic violence, the most extreme violence can explode. This wasn't a calculated serial killer. This wasn't someone luring victims over months. This was a spontaneous act of familial rage, and it was just as terrifying. Behind every sensational nickname is a deeper human tragedy. The Scissor sisters weren't monsters from birth, but in one night, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They didn't just kill, they desecrated, and in doing so, they left behind a story of rage, dysfunction, and irreversible destruction that haunts Ireland to this day. 12. Karen Harrington. She was trusted to care for children. That's what made the betrayal unbearable. In 2019, the people of Cork, Ireland were left reeling after the brutal killing of 2-year-old Santina Cawley, a child who had barely begun her life, at the hands of a woman who had been entrusted with her safety. 37-year-old Karen Harrington. Karen wasn't a stranger. She was known to Santina's family and was in a relationship with the toddler's father at the time. On the night of the murder, Santina had been left in Karen's apartment while her father went out. What happened next remains one of the most disturbing crimes in recent Irish memory. In the early hours of the morning, emergency responders arrived at the scene to find Santina's tiny body severely beaten. She had suffered 53 injuries to her head, spine, abdomen, legs, and arms. There were signs of blunt force trauma, internal bleeding, and broken bones. Despite efforts to save her, the child was pronounced dead at the hospital. Karen Harrington denied everything. She claimed Santina must have injured herself or that someone else had harmed her. But the evidence painted a different picture, one of rage, violence, and unthinkable cruelty. Her alibi unraveled. The timeline, the physical evidence, the testimonies, all pointed to one person. During the trial, the court heard how Karen's volatile behavior had been escalating in the days leading up to the child's death. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, crying, and disturbing noises from the apartment that night. One witness even described hearing a child screaming in terror, followed by eerie silence. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. Karen Harrington was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. She showed little emotion as the verdict was read, but the courtroom and the country was overcome with sorrow. A nation mourned the life of a child who had no defense, no chance, and no idea that the person who was supposed to protect her would become her killer. Karen's case wasn't that of a serial killer or a calculated murderer. It was the story of unchecked rage, of a person unfit to be around children, and of a catastrophic failure of judgment that led to an innocent child's death. But the horror remains the same, and in some ways, it's worse. Because Santina trusted her. And trust, once broken in this way, scars an entire community. Karen Harrington now lives out her days behind bars. But the memory of Santina, her smile, her laughter, her innocence, lives on in the hearts of a nation still asking, how could anyone do this to a child? They weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were mothers, nurses, caregivers, lovers, the kind of women you might pass in a grocery store, sit beside on a bus, or trust with your child. But beneath the ordinary smiles and soft voices, something darker was waiting. These 12 women didn't just commit murder, they shattered the illusion of safety. Each case revealed a terrible truth. That evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears makeup. Sometimes it sings lullabies. Sometimes it makes you tea and tells you everything will be okay. But behind that calm exterior can lurk a deadly storm, driven by greed, revenge, obsession, jealousy, or a need for control. Dorothea Puente buried tenants while collecting their checks. Jane Toppan held her victims' hands as she poisoned them. Karen Harrington stood over a dying toddler and claimed she did nothing wrong. And the most chilling part? Most of them didn't look back. They lied. They smiled. They posed for mugshots like nothing had happened. We're used to fearing the stranger in the dark. But what happens when the real danger lives right next door? When the person we trust the most is the one who does the most damage? That's what makes these cases so disturbing. Not just the crimes, but the betrayal of every role these women were supposed to play. We tell ourselves we'd know, we'd see the signs, But time and time again, these killers slipped through unnoticed, until it was far too late. And even now, with the truth exposed, one question remains unanswered. If killers can look like caregivers, how can we ever truly know who to trust? Let us know in the comments, which of these stories shocked you the most? And why do you think these women crossed that line? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling, true crime stories from around the world. And if you've got a case you think we should cover, drop it below. Because sometimes, the most terrifying killers are the ones we never see coming.